In today's episode, we'll be sharing some chilling Thanksgiving horror stories. But before we begin, consider giving us a like. It helps a lot. Also, if you've got a true horror story of your own, send it to me, and I'll probably add it to a future video. Thanksgiving 2020 had been a whirlwind, a day packed with celebration and chaos. It began with good news. I had just passed a major exam in my nursing program. The weight of weeks of study and stress lifted, and I felt lighter than I had in months. My boyfriend and his family were the first to congratulate me, pulling me into their festive celebration with food, laughter, and the comforting warmth of holiday traditions. The afternoon transitioned into an evening at my sister's house, where the excitement continued. Between catching up with family, sharing stories, and juggling the holidays' chaos, I barely had time to think. By the time dessert was served, I was running on fumes, but the day's joy kept me going. As the night wound down, I faced a decision. My boyfriend was temporarily staying 3 hours away in a rural area, and I had promised to join him there. It was late, nearly 3:30 a.m., but I didn't want to disappoint him or miss the chance to end the day with him. Despite his hesitation and repeated offers for me to stay the night and drive in the morning, I brushed off his concerns and insisted I was fine. The road was calling, and I assured myself it was just another drive. The drive started with small annoyances that set the tone for what would become a night I'd never forget. Before I even reached the highway, I got turned around on a familiar street, wasting 10 minutes correcting my mistake. Then, in my rush to leave, I thought I'd forgotten my vape pens, which had become a habit for calming my nerves. They were there, tucked into my bag the whole time, but the momentary panic left me frazzled. Once I left Sacramento city limits, the familiar glow of streetlights gave way to darkness. The road ahead stretched long and quiet, flanked by empty fields and trees that looked more ominous in the faint moonlight. I turned up the music, trying to shake off my lingering frustrations and focus on the drive. My exhaustion was creeping in, but I reassured myself I could handle it. I just had to stay alert. About 30 minutes into the trip, I found myself briefly racing another car, a momentary lapse in judgment. It was playful at first, an unspoken game to see who could pass the other, but I backed off quickly, realizing it was childish. As the other car sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the headlights of a lifted Ford truck behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it. Trucks were common on these rural roads, but as I continued, the truck stayed close, its headlights glaring in my mirror like twin spotlights. I changed lanes, expecting it to pass, but it followed. I slowed down slightly, hoping to create distance, but the truck mirrored my every move. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as unease settled in. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, now felt suffocating. This wasn't coincidence. Something was wrong. The truck's presence grew more menacing with each passing mile. No matter what I did, changing lanes, slowing down, speeding up, it stayed glued to my bumper. The bright headlights bore into my rearview mirror, casting sharp beams across the dark interior of my car. My unease morphed into full-blown fear as I realized the driver wasn't just following me, they were targeting me. I glanced over my shoulder as the truck pulled alongside my car, close enough for me to see the driver's face. He was a man, his features partially obscured by the dim light, but his eyes locked on mine with a chilling intensity. His expression was unreadable, neither angry nor amused, just focused. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity before swerving back behind me. I tried to think rationally. Maybe he was just being an aggressive driver, someone trying to scare me for fun. But that didn't explain the persistence. This wasn't a busy highway with other cars around, just me and him on a dark, empty stretch of road. My heart pounded as I realized how vulnerable I was. There was nowhere to pull off, no gas stations or stores in sight, just endless pavement and the faint silhouettes of trees on either side. Then the truck began to accelerate, racing ahead of me before slamming on its brakes. I swerved into the other lane, narrowly avoiding a collision. My hands trembled as I fought to regain control of the car. I sped up, hoping to lose him, but he matched my speed effortlessly, weaving back and forth across the lanes as if to block my path. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. My car wasn't built for high-speed chases, and the truck's erratic behavior made every move feel like a gamble. But fear overpowered logic, and I pushed my foot down on the gas, watching the speedometer climb to 80, then 90, then 100. My engine roared in protest, but I didn't dare let up. I had to get away. The road ahead curved sharply, and in my desperation, I veered into the oncoming lane to overtake a big rig. My tires screeched as I barely made it past, cutting the truck off and forcing it to slow down. It bought me a few precious seconds, enough to gain some distance. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the truck's headlights growing smaller. The driver seemingly caught off guard by my reckless maneuver. The moment I spotted a brightly lit store ahead, I swerved into the parking lot without hesitation. My car skidded to a stop, and I practically stumbled out, my legs trembling beneath me. The fluorescent lights of the store felt like a sanctuary, their harsh glare a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the road. Inside, I realized how visibly shaken I was. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, and tears streamed down my face. The clerk behind the counter gave me a concerned look as I fumbled for a cup of coffee, trying to calm myself with the familiarity of the routine. A few other customers glanced my way, their sympathetic expressions reminding me how close I had come to something far worse. It took almost an hour for me to gather the courage to leave the store and continue the drive. My hands still felt unsteady on the steering wheel as I navigated the final stretch of rural road. Every pair of headlights in the distance made my heart race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the truck might reappear. When I finally reached my boyfriend's house, I broke down completely. The sight of him at the door, his concern etched into his face, was enough to release all the fear and adrenaline I had been holding in. I collapsed into his arms, sobbing as I recounted every detail of the terrifying encounter. He listened intently, his expression shifting from worry to anger as I described the truck's persistence. "You shouldn't have been driving that late," he said gently but firmly, his arms tightening around me. "Promise me you won't do this again." To this day, I avoid traveling alone at night, especially on rural roads. The experience left me more cautious, more wary of the unknown. And though I'll never know who was behind the wheel of that truck or what their intentions were, the encounter serves as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable we are when we're alone on the open road. The days leading up to Thanksgiving 2018 were quiet for the most part. At the time, I was living with two female roommates in an apartment complex bordered by a patch of dense woods. It was a nice enough place, affordable, with plenty of space for the three of us and our dog. The woods provided a kind of secluded charm, but as the weather turned colder and the days shorter, they began to feel more ominous than peaceful. One evening, I volunteered to take the dog out for a quick walk. The air was crisp, and the sky was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlights around the complex. As I walked toward the edge of the woods, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I turned to see a group of men emerging from the trees. There were 4 of them, all large and rough-looking, with tattooed arms visible even under their jackets. They didn't seem to belong there. Their presence alone made me uneasy, but what really unsettled me was the way they moved, slowly, deliberately, like they were surveying the area. "Hey," one of them called out, his voice gruff but casual. I froze for a moment, unsure whether to respond or walk away. Before I could decide, he asked, "You live here?" "Yeah," I replied hesitantly, tightening my grip on the dog's leash. The man nodded, then asked a strange question. "You know where Unit 224 is?" I blinked, caught off guard. I'd lived in the complex for over a year and knew every building and unit by heart. There was no Unit 224. I don't think that exists here," I said cautiously. The man exchanged glances with his companions, who were all watching me intently. My heart started pounding. Something wasn't right. The man shrugged, muttered a quick, "Thanks," and the group walked away, disappearing around the corner of one of the buildings. I didn't wait to see where they went. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Once inside, I told my roommates about the encounter. One of them, Sarah, immediately perked up. "I saw those guys earlier," she said. "They've been hanging around all afternoon, just pacing between the woods and the parking lot." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. If they'd been lingering for hours, what were they doing? My other roommate, Jess, chimed in, suggesting we call the police. At first, I hesitated. The men hadn't done anything overtly threatening, yet. But the more I thought about their strange questions and their demeanor, the more uneasy I felt. We decided it was better to be safe than sorry and dialed 911. While we were on the phone with the dispatcher, we peeked out the windows. The group was still outside, but now they were leaving in a white pickup truck. The truck rolled slowly out of the parking lot, but before it could disappear into the night, we saw flashing red and blue lights. 4 police cars roared into the complex, pulling the truck over right at the entrance. Our apartment erupted into nervous whispers as we watched the scene unfold. Officers surrounded the vehicle, their flashlights sweeping over the group as they were ordered out of the truck one by one. The search that followed revealed drugs and firearms, and several arrests were made on the spot. For a brief moment, we felt relieved. Whatever threat these men posed had seemingly been neutralized. But as I replayed the encounter in my mind, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. Something about the way they had asked about the apartments, especially that non-existent unit, kept gnawing at me. From the safety of our apartment, we watched as the police officers thoroughly searched the white pickup truck. The men were lined up outside, their hands cuffed behind their backs, their postures tense but resigned. A few officers examined the truck bed while others combed through the cab, pulling out items that made our stomachs churn: firearms, baggies of what appeared to be drugs, and other unidentifiable objects wrapped in black plastic. "Holy crap," Sarah muttered, her face pale as she peeked through the blinds. What the hell were they planning? The officers didn't seem to take long in their assessment. After loading the men into patrol cars, they drove away, leaving the truck behind to be towed. Jess locked the door again, triple-checking the deadbolt, while I paced back and forth, replaying the strange encounter in my mind. The relief of seeing the men taken away was tempered by a lingering unease. Why had they been asking about an apartment number that didn't exist? What would have happened if we hadn't called 911? Those questions hung heavy in the air, even as we tried to convince ourselves the worst was over. Thanksgiving came and went without incident. The day was a welcome distraction, filled with family, food, and laughter. By the time the evening rolled around, I was exhausted but content, ready to head back to the apartment after a long day of festivities. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the dent in the steel front door. It wasn't huge, but it was unmistakable, a jagged inward curve as though someone had struck it with considerable force. My heart dropped. "Jess? Sarah?" I called out as I stepped inside, my voice shaky. Jess came down the stairs, rubbing her eyes, clearly having just woken up. She stopped mid-step when she saw the door. "What the hell happened?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. She ran to inspect it, her hands brushing over the dent as if that would explain what had caused it. Neither of us had an answer, but the implications were chilling. Someone had tried to force their way in, and they hadn't been subtle about it. The steel door and the deadbolt had held, but the thought of someone violently testing their strength against our home made my skin crawl. We called the police immediately. 2 officers arrived within minutes. They took our statements, inspected the damage, and ultimately concluded that the attempted break-in was likely random. But as I stood there, watching them drive away, I couldn't shake the suspicion that it wasn't random at all. After the police left, Jess and I stayed up, waiting for Sarah to return from her family's Thanksgiving dinner. When she finally came through the door, we showed her the dent and told her everything that had happened. Her reaction mirrored our own, fear mixed with disbelief. "It has to be them," she said, her voice low, "the guys from the truck." The possibility felt too real to dismiss. Retaliation. It made sense. They might have suspected we'd been the ones to call the police. Whether or not they had proof, it wouldn't have mattered. They could have returned to send a message. Thanksgiving 2011 was like most holidays for me. Quiet, spent with family, and filled with traditions. That year, I had driven out to my grandparents' farm in Seville, Florida, a small, rural town with wide-open fields and old country roads. The day was peaceful and predictable, a perfect escape from the stress of college life. We ate a huge meal, played cards, and shared stories around the fire pit until the stars came out. By the time I got back in my car to head home, I was content and drowsy, the kind of tired that makes you feel safe and warm. The road back to campus stretched long and empty, lined with endless trees and the occasional flicker of a passing porch light. I had about a half tank of gas when I left my grandparents' place, but the needle was dipping lower than I liked, so I decided to stop at a small station just outside of town. The place was dimly lit, the kind of old gas station that had probably been around since the 70s, but it felt quiet and safe enough. I pulled up to the pump and began filling my tank, the stillness of the night interrupted only by the faint hum of insects and the occasional shuffle of leaves in the breeze. That's when I saw her. She appeared seemingly out of nowhere, walking toward me from the far edge of the lot. Her hair was dirty and matted, hanging in ratty blonde clumps over her face. Her clothes were worn and didn't seem to fit right, like they'd been picked up at random. There was something about her that instantly made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on it. "Hey," she called out as she approached, her voice hoarse but loud enough to carry in the quiet night. "You got any cash? My car's out of gas." I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. She was close now, standing just a few feet from me, her face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent light of the gas pump. Her eyes darted around, never quite meeting mine, and she shifted her weight nervously from one foot to the other. "I don't have cash," I said cautiously, glancing at the pump as if to signal that I was busy. "But I can fill your tank for you." Her reaction surprised me. Instead of agreeing, she hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she waved off the offer. "Nah, it's not that simple," she said quickly. "My car can't get to the pump. It's too far back." The excuse didn't make much sense, but I didn't press her on it. After a few moments of back and forth, she produced a red plastic gas can from somewhere behind her. "Okay, here," she said, shoving it toward me. I reluctantly agreed, stepping away from my own car to help fill the can. As I poured the gas, her demeanor shifted. She moved closer, uncomfortably so, and placed a hand on my shoulder. Her fingers lingered there, cold and unfamiliar. "You're sweet," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "What's your name?" Her hand lingered on my shoulder, sending an uneasy chill down my spine. I stepped back slightly, trying to put some space between us, but she moved closer again. "You're such a nice guy," she said, her voice dripping with something that wasn't quite gratitude. Her eyes flitted to my car and then back to me. "What are you doing out here so late? Got a girlfriend? A family?" The questions caught me off guard, too personal and invasive for what should have been a brief interaction. "Just heading home," I said curtly, focusing on filling the gas can. My discomfort grew with each passing second, her erratic energy making it impossible to relax. Then her tone shifted again. "I could repay you," she said, her voice dropping into a strange, almost seductive whisper. I froze, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. Before I could respond, she leaned in slightly, her expression unnervingly calm. "You know, for helping me out." My stomach turned as I realized what she was suggesting. "That's not necessary," I said quickly, handing her the filled gas can. "You're good to go." Instead of taking the can, she stared at me, her smile faltering for the first time. Her eyes darkened, and her demeanor turned cold. "You sure?" she asked, her voice now sharp and clipped. I nodded, stepping back toward my car. She finally grabbed the gas can and muttered something under her breath before turning and walking toward the edge of the lot. I didn't wait to see where she went. Heart pounding, I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped away. The drive back to campus felt longer than usual. My hands trembled on the wheel, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. Her erratic behavior and unsettling comments left me rattled. By the time I reached home, exhaustion had settled in, but the unease from the gas station lingered. The next morning, while talking to my mother over the phone, I mentioned the incident, expecting her to laugh it off as a weird Thanksgiving story. Instead, she fell silent. "What did she look like?" my mom finally asked, her tone serious. I described the woman: ratty blonde hair, dirty clothes, nervous energy. My mom's response chilled me to the bone. "That's the woman from the news," she said, "the one whose baby was kidnapped." I didn't understand at first, but my mom quickly filled in the details. The woman had been involved in a horrifying incident not long before Thanksgiving. She was a local prostitute who had attended a party where an exchange had gone wrong. One of her clients, reportedly high and enraged, had taken her infant child and abandoned the baby under a bush. Miraculously, the child had been found alive, but the story was a grim reminder of the dangers lurking in the area. The woman and her client had both been arrested after the incident. According to my mom, she was recently released, and her erratic behavior at the gas station now made sense in the worst way. The revelation left me shaken. What I had initially dismissed as a bizarre but harmless interaction now felt far more sinister. This woman wasn't just some stranger down on her luck. She was tied to a dark and disturbing story that had unfolded just miles from where I stood.